what I'm going to talk about is vertical restructuring of infrastructure in ways to try and improve the performance of PPPs and other forms of privatized infrastructure. And let's see if I can do this. And I'm going to look at two applications, or two reforms. One is called open access, where the idea is that you divide up the infrastructure into the potentially competitive and not competitive parts. Open access, the idea is that most network industries, most infrastructure industries, are natural monopolies, but that natural monopoly resides in only a portion of the activities that the industry does. And so if one breaks apart the firms to separate out the potentially competitive part from the non-competitive part, you can improve the performance. The hope is you can improve the performance. And you can see here the industries in which it's been applied, or at least 4 of them. In railroads, the idea is that the natural monopoly resides in the track and not in the trains, that you can have competition from independent train operators running over the tracks. And in electricity, the monopoly lies in the medium and low voltage distribution lines. And you can have competition in power generation. And in telecoms, the monopoly is in the last mile and not in the content, and so on. But basically the idea is separate out the potentially competitive parts and allow free entry or open access to them to improve the performance of the firm. Whoops. The second is the scope of public-private partnerships. Right? I'm sure if you've done anything in PPPs, you've heard this alphabet soup of activities that design, build, operate, transfer, finance, and so on. So people talk about BOTs and the like. And the real question is, what of those generic activities do you want to put in the PPP, and what do you want to leave in the public sector? And the idea, people who worry about finance generally focus on the risk allocation, where the idea is that you allocate the risks to the party that can control them best, and that means you'll reduce them as a result. So in PPPs and infrastructure, usually the construction is allocated to the concessionaire because the concessionaire is usually a consortium of construction and other companies, and thus can manage that the best. Whereas permitting is a government responsibility and they control it best. So the risks associated with permitting are allocated to the government. And then there's some risks like demand, which are hard to allocate because neither the government nor the concessionaire may have full control over it. But the idea is allocate the risks to the party that controls it, and you'll reduce it. But this PPP scope question is, there are also some activities that are whose coordination is vital to the performance of the PPP, and so they're best done together. And the issue in common for those of you who are, I understand this is partly a class in urban economics, but for those of you who are economics majors, this is an application of an issue that's very important in economics. The vertical integration or bundling decision. And the basic problem is the make or buy decision of the firm, right? Firms assemble parts together, let's say to build an automobile. And they have to decide whether or not to buy the parts from outside vendors, right? Or make the parts themselves. And in one of the cleverest and most famous institutional economics works by Oliver Williamson uses transaction costs to explain this choice. Right? Transaction costs are the costs of negotiating and enforcing and monitoring an agreement between two independent parties, two people or two companies. And the idea is that the firm will buy if what they're talking about is a standard component that they can get on a spot market. Because you have more competition in procurement, you have more reliability because you've got multiple suppliers. But if the part requires relationship-specific investments, right? If you need special tooling to build the body panels, let's say, of the car, and investments that the supplier is not going to make without some real firm commitment by you, the manufacturer, to buy enough parts to cover that relationship-specific investment, then you may make it internally. You may decide to make it internally, right? And there's a kind of competition coordination trade-off, right? On the other hand, one hand, buying the part on the market, you get a lot of competition, but benefits, but very little coordination. You're going to be buying something that's fairly standardized. And if coordination is important, right, then you might want to make the part yourself as opposed to buy it. And open access is basically an unbundling, right? Saying, let's get a little more competition by buying some of the parts, by unbundling them, even if there's a loss in some coordination between the activities. And the PPP scope is the other way. You're bundling. Let's put activities together that are important to be coordinated, and that'll give us a better result. But you sacrifice some competition by doing it. Hopefully this abstract stuff will be apparent with some examples. Let me do open access first and illustrate this by talking about how it varies between railroads, and I have in mind here intercity railroads versus electricity. Because this open access reform, which I think you've all probably heard about, is more popular and successful in electricity than it is in railroads. But electricity, almost every country is doing it to some degree or another. And in railroads, there's a big debate between Europe and Australia, on the one hand, who are pursuing open access in their railroads, and the Americas and Japan and Korea, which are not, which are rejecting open access. But you can understand the trade-off between competition and coordination, how it varies. And that it explains why electricity is more popular than railroads. I mean, the competitive gains are going to be large, right? If there's little existing competition from other industries. You know, and this really hurts, I think, the case for open access in railroads. I mean, railroads, if anything, are suffering from too much competition already from trucks and planes and buses and so on. So the notion that you're going to get big benefits by adding some more competition, by having train operators compete against each other, right, that means that benefit is not as big. The second factor that affects the competitive advantages is what share of the industry's costs are in the activities that have been broken out as potentially competitive. And their rail and electricity are roughly similar, because power generation is about half or a little more of the total costs of electricity in many systems. And in railroads, it varies a lot depending upon whether you're talking about passenger or freight and what quality passenger. But to a first approximation, train operations are about half of the cost of a rail system. So the coordination losses are larger if you've got a couple of things going for you. One is that if services are delivered on platforms, on the platform that are very heterogeneous, and their railway has a real disadvantage relative to electricity. With electricity, you don't care. The output is really homogeneous. You don't care whose electron you are using to light your light or charge your computer. Right? You don't care what plant it was developed in. And therefore, since an electron is an electron, we can have markets in wholesale power. With railroads, on the other hand, you may have, and you do have, particularly in Europe, the same track being used by slow commuter trains, by faster intercity trains, by heavy axle freight trains, and so on. And the tailoring of the infrastructure to the train operations is really important. I mean, just a simple example. If you are designing a passenger railroad system, then you would like to super elevate the track around the curves because you can go faster around the curves. But if you then run a heavy freight train with 30 or 35 ton axles around that same curve, you destroy the inside of the curve by putting all the weight on the side of the rail. So you really want it there are benefits for tailoring the platform to the services that are larger in rail than they are in electricity. Access to the entire platform is necessary for competition. One of the things that can be wonderful is if you don't need to open the entire platform, but just a bottleneck to let, so that the coordination problems are limited to that bottleneck. And that happens sometimes in railroads. The platform is operating close to capacity. If you have to make investments in capacity, you've got a lot of independent users of the platform. They may have different interests and different desires. And if the technology is changing, right, it's even worse. Because how can you coordinate or gain the approval and support for various experiments or investments that you might want to make in the platform if they're really heterogeneous users? You know, will the freight trains and the passenger trains agree on what investments ought to be made and when they ought to be made, whether capacity is needed? Whoops. So just a couple of basic things before we talk about PPPs and how that breaks down. There are really two circumstances that favor PPPs that are important, and this is a great oversimplification. But one of them is that there are prospects for real efficiency gains, right? That you have a reason to believe that the private sector can do something faster, better, or whatever, as opposed to transfers. PPPs are often done as an excuse to transfer costs from one party to another, you know, to raise prices in an unprofitable state-owned enterprise or infrastructure facility, to shed excess labor, et cetera. And if they're transfers, if that's what's really going on in a PPP, then a PPP becomes a zero-sum game, right? Then if I win, you lose, and vice versa. But if they're real efficiency gains, then the PPP can become what we call in economics Pareto optimal, right? That it's possible for the winners to compensate the losers and for it to essentially become a win-win proposition. So you want real efficiency gains rather than transfers, and you want competition. You may not have perfect competition, but if you have some competition, It's beneficial in two regards. One is it distributes the net benefits more widely, right, which is politically advantageous. But the second is that it reduces the need for tariff regulation. And we basically have, with infrastructure, two strategies for tariff regulation, neither of which work very well, or both of which have their defects. The first strategy, and the most popular one, is the concession contract, right? Which is really appealing and is because it's simple and transparent, right? If you offer a concession to build and operate a piece of infrastructure for 20 years or something like that, you write a contract that specifies all the obligation of the state to the concessionaire and the concessionaire to the state, so that neither party can take advantage of the fact that they've made durable relation-specific investments during the life of the concession. And you rebid that concession periodically to make sure that the terms are fair and up to date. It sounds wonderful, and it is very attractive. But the Achilles heel of the concession contract system is what we call the incomplete contract. It's what happens when you don't foresee some important eventuality and provide an adequate contingency for it in the contract, so that the contract no longer serves the purposes of at least one of the parties, and often both. And if you've got an incomplete contract, you are faced with a terrible choice, whether or not to live with the inadequate contract that may be producing infrastructure services that are not needed or in unnecessarily expensive ways or whatever, or renegotiate the contract without the benefit of competitive tendering, right? And governments usually choose to renegotiate, but I think that often undermines the integrity and political support for the concession system if that's what's being done. So you want real efficiency gains, and you want competition, at least some competition if you can find it. Just a little note on the role of private capital. One of the things that are most often offered as a motive for PPPs is the ability to tap private capital markets to raise money for badly needed infrastructure investments. But what's important to understand is that if you borrow money on financial markets, right, you got to repay it. And so the real question about whether or not you should tap the private financial markets with a PPP is whether you can do better on your interest rate. And usually, public debt is cheaper than the weighted average cost of capital on a private market. In American toll roads, for example, you can issue a public bond for about 6% interest, whereas the concessionaires want 9% or more in weighted average cost of capital. So if raising money on capital markets is your thing, you're much better off doing it as a public rather than a private. Or another way to put it is that there's a lot easier ways of raising money than writing a concession contract, right? Issuing a bond, a public bond, is much easier. The real reason for using expensive private finance is so that the investor has some skin in the game, right? So that they're motivated to find the real efficiency gains. But it's not tapping the private market per se. That's a smart idea. So what are the sources of real efficiency gains? The first two are ones you hear often. Focused accountability. That's a nice way of saying that the managers care only about what the investors are getting for a return, or primarily, and don't have wider responsibilities, right? So that it's easy for them to fire excess labor, raise prices, and do things that might improve productivity, make hard decisions, because they're not responsible to a wider audience, unlike public managers. The second one is this allocation of risk to the party that can bear. The people who do finance stress that a lot in the design of PPPs, right? If you do allocate the risk to the party that controls them, they'll have an incentive to reduce those risks. But this is the one that's related to the make or buy decision that I want to illustrate a little bit more. And that is the subject of my current work, which is why you have to listen to this, because I'm interested in it. But it's the bundling or integration of activities that are normally procured separately. And you can think of it as the scope of the PPP. You know, how broad a PPP are you going to have? If you do PPPs, you've undoubtedly heard, as I said earlier, about this alphabet soup of different activities that you might put in the PPP: design, finance, build, operate, transfer, maintain, et cetera. So how many of those things are you going to bundle together in a contract? The traditional public procurement has separate contracts for each activity, right? So you write a contract to somebody to design the hospital or the train station or whatever. You ask, then offer a contract competitively procured for someone to build it, and then another one for someone to finance it, and another one for someone to operate it and maintain it, right? Separate contracts. It doesn't have to be that way, but usually protections against corruption in public contracting and so on encourage this kind of. But a real hallmark of PPPs, and one of the most interesting sources of efficiency gains, I think, is this bundling. And you can imagine why. I mean, why do we have design build as a common combination? Because you don't want the designer to design something that's not very buildable, right? Or for the builder to not have a say in the design about it. So there's synergies to putting these two together, right? There's trade-offs that they can make that they're not going to make if you do them as separate contracts. And two of the most common bundles are where you put building, operating, and maintaining together, a BOT or BOMT or a BFMONT. And what that gets you is the life cycle perspective. Right now, you got incentives because you're going to operate and maintain that facility for 20 years as well as build it and design it, right? To figure out what the best way to do that, make all those trade-offs that are possible within it. Or design, build, operate, transfer. What you get with that, by adding design to the beginning, often is what I call a services perspective rather than an assets perspective. Right? You're not buying an asset. You're buying a stream of services. So you don't really care about the alignment of the highway in the rural area too much. You care about, or necessarily the number of lanes. You care about being able to have X thousand cars per day, right, on Sunday afternoon when they're coming back from the beaches or whatever. What it does is it encourages you to write a contract for the services you really care about, right, rather than the facility you think would be best. And that means you're going to get more creativity. But remember when I told you that this is all about vertical restructuring and coordination versus competition trade-offs. And we saw that coordination competition in the open access. Here's the coordination competition in bundling, right? The efficiency gains are pretty obvious. That you get greater coordination of the activities than you would if they were in separate contracts. But in addition, there's a related benefit, which is that there's less finger pointing, right? There's only one person that's responsible, or one company that's responsible for all of the tasks that you bundle together. So I can't point at you and say, that's your crummy building, or it's your crummy design, right? I'm responsible for both of those. And I think this is actually more important in countries with weak institutions than in more developed places. Because what it means is you only need one contract to monitor instead of monitoring 4 or 5 contracts. You're really only monitoring one. But there are competition losses that are important from bundling. And one of them is that there are a few firms that you're going to find that have all the skills that are needed for the bundle. And the more you bundle together, the harder it is to find a firm. So it's harder to get bidding for it. What has to happen usually is that a couple of firms with the different skills put together a consortium to bid. And the construction of those consortiums is actually one of the most creative parts of this process, right? Because it's when the consortium gets together that it has to figure out how it's going to handle all the trade-offs inherent in the bundling. But it means that there's tremendous kind of fixed cost for people who are trying to bid. And it generates rules of thumb, like that a PPP project that's going to have a lot of bundling has to be at least $100 million or something like that. You know, that kind of scale. Longer duration of the contract. Right? If you're going to go for life cycle costing by combining designing and building with maintaining and operating, then you need a contract that is the life of the asset, the principal asset that you're creating. And the longer the contract, the more the risk that it's going to be incomplete. So you have more regulation risk and problems there. And with that incomplete contract, I never really talked about, there's a second option that you do, what we call discretionary regulation, where you create a regulator that has more than the authority to just monitor the compliance of the concessionaire with the contract. It has the authority to unilaterally change the terms of the contract as new information comes in. And investors don't like it. Politicians don't like it very much. So you have to have kind of an independence and accountability in this discretionary regulator. It has to be protected somewhat from day-to-day political pressures by not being appointed to at the pleasure of the president or whoever is doing the appointment, but to a fixed term. Often a commission with staggered fixed terms. Often the budget does not go through the regular state budget, but so that the legislature can't retaliate against the agency if it doesn't like it. Then you have to have it has to be accountable as well as independent. So there usually has to be a statute that lays out the principles that it should adhere to when trying to set a tariff, and an appeals process in case people think that they didn't really apply the statute well. So contracting becomes more of a problem, and you're more likely to be relying on discretionary regulation. And because this is urban economics, I just thought I'd illustrate the trade-offs in P3 scopes, using buses and, in the case of Singapore's MRT system. Competition problems are greater if the key assets are long-lived, right? That's a problem for MRT and not for buses. And over here, standardized equipment and synergies with other industries are coordination benefits that you don't get with buses, if you do buses. Buses generally are a lower stakes activity to bundle or to unbundle. Or, you know, on the one hand, you can have a shortish contract because the asset's not that long lived, right? It's 10 or 12 years, maybe 15. On the other hand, there's more standardization and less opportunities for synergies with other industries. Yep.
What does MRT stands for?
Mass rapid transit. It's the Asians call their subways. Thanks. Whoops. So urban buses. As I said, that urban buses are not a big deal. Not as high stakes a choice as MRTs. And I want to put aside the bus systems that are competition on the road, you know, which are usually the one driver, one bus owner systems you find in many poorer developing countries, where they chase each other for passengers on the roadside, and there's a lot of chaos and danger. But more talk about more developed countries which have competition for the road instead of on the road. And it usually takes the form of competition for exclusive franchises, which, as I understand, is what you have here in Buenos Aires. The most common form is just plain operate and maintain contract, and often for less than 10 years. I mean, Singapore has 5-year operate and maintain contracts. And that means that the public sector supplies the buses, right, and finances them. And less common are buy, operate, maintain, where you actually do get the life cycle perspective. It's interesting that just a 5-year or a 7-year extension of the contract, right, is perceived as risky enough, limiting enough, that these are not more popular, the buy, operate, maintain. But let me tell you, on MRT, most lines are public, completely public. Most MRT lines, right? The public designs, finances, builds, operates, maintains, etc. If there's going to be PPP involved, it's offered just an operate and maintain contract with maybe some initial investment. And that's the Buenos Aires privatizations that were in the early 90s were essentially this form. They might have to You had to invest in some rolling stock, right, or something like that, but not a big, heavy capital investment. Less common are design, build, finance, operate, maintain systems, of which many metropolitan areas, and a number of metropolitan areas that have been building MRT systems rapidly, like Beijing or Seoul, have one or two lines that are design, build. And they've become often the models for the pure public ones. You don't go back to do another one of them, but they're said to be influential. The super bundle puts in ancillary investments in property development, right? In Hong Kong's, they used to call them MTR. That's their mass transit railway, just to confuse us, as opposed to MRT. But Hong Kong's MTR is the most famous example. But there are actually a bunch of Japanese urban railways that are essentially property development companies with trains that were built to support that property development. Hong Kong was 1975, and they decided to do it because they didn't have enough money and they needed to clear some land anyway for yards and stations. But they call Hong Kong MTR a property plus company, where the plus is, and if you go to the Hong Kong MTR, it's like going to one of these airports, right? You can hardly find the station platform for the retailing. But it's one of the only MRTs in the world that is financially self-supporting by the end of this lecture. So let me tell you the story of, just to illustrate how this choice works out, of Singapore's mass rapid transit company, which built its first transit lines, and it took over its first transit lines that a predecessor corporation had built, and has maintained and operated the system since, as it's expanded from about 50 kilometers to about 200 kilometers. But it starts way at the other end of it starts as a design, build, finance, operate, maintain, transfer after 30 years, concession. But really an aggressive, but slowly runs into trouble. The original corporation was responsible for replacing the assets, the rolling stock, et cetera. And that responsibility slowly shifted from the enterprise to the government as a result of a couple of the government's decisions. In particular, as the system was expanding, the cost per passenger rose because they were extending their lines farther out into the hinterland of Singapore, where there was less density in ridership, and the volumes were getting to be such that as they approached the downtown, they had to go underground sooner, right? Because the city was being built up. So the costs were going up. And fares were very sensitive. I don't know whether you know much about Singapore, but it's one of the few places where the automobile pays its way and maybe then some. They have lots of special taxes, and they're famous for their congestion tolls and the like. But what it means is that only a small minority of the population can afford cars. And it makes bus and MRT fares very sensitive because the population feels a little trapped. And so the Passenger Transport Council, which was the regulator, stopped approving fare increases that its formulas suggested that were warranted. And the Passenger Transport Council was neither independent. It was a body of 14 people, great citizens, appointed to 2-year terms by the Ministry of Transport. And there was no appeals process, right? So there was no way, no institutional scaffolding to stop this from happening. The government trying to control the cost of SMRT even further, listed on the Singapore Stock Exchange. Right? And it gets a new CEO who promises dividends, and she delivers. She delivers by developing, by doing two things. One, we later find out, not doing maintenance that was called for. But second and more interesting, well, I don't know, they're both interesting, but turning the stations into shopping centers practically, doubling the amount of retail space under her control, and being the source of the only profits that they made. You know, it was about $1 billion Singapore dollars turnover, and zero profits when she came, and it was 100 million in profits, about 10%, by the time she was finished. So they start to have a series of breakdowns, which completely humiliate the Singaporeans because they're so justifiably proud of how well they run everything. And there's a commission of inquiry that says, you know, that what happened were classic coordination problems. I mean, they don't put it that way, but that one classic coordination problem on rail systems is that it's important for the wheels to be completely round, right? It's a steel-on-steel technology, and it's very unforgiving. If you get flat spots in your wheels, it damages the rails and the power distribution, you know, the third rail. It causes a lot of vibration. They had not been truing their wheels. So the government bought back the stock, bought the operating assets that the SMRT had remaining, and is now doing a new strategy where they're going to have asset light, is what they call it. Bidding for operating and maintenance contracts on the rail lines, right? They've gone from one extreme, DBF, MOT, right, to OM. And the government's going to have to micromanage the maintenance. Don't need that. So just a couple of lessons from SMRT. I think it really shows the danger of splitting the designer builder finance part from the operator maintain part. You know, wheel flats were not the only, they didn't do the annual inspections of the covers that over the power, the third rail. People respond to the incentives, and it almost, I think it matters less whether they were both activities in the public sector or both activities in the private sector. But both activities in the same sector would be important, right? Either go OM and the design build both in the public, or do them both in the private, but don't do them separately. The importance of the regulator. You know, you don't think about this, but particularly if you're going to go with these kind of more I'm searching for a word, significant bundling or extensive bundling, that your contracts are bound to be incomplete if you're using contracts, and you're likely to be smart to rely on a discretionary agency to begin with. But you got to make sure that that agency is properly designed, particularly if you're going for the more aggressive. And then finally, for those of us in urban, right, urban buses, I think they ought to have life cycle incentives in there, but they don't. And they're much easier than MRT. So, you know, usually in the course of a lecture I figure out. So this vertical restructuring, I think, is kind of sweeping the infrastructure area, and particularly the open access has been probably the most hotly debated question in infrastructure aside from privatization, or whether you do a P3. And indeed, the government of Argentina is thinking about how to redo their railroad concessions, and one issue is exactly this kind of question. But open access and PPP are two sides of the same coin, right? Open access assumes that there's too much bundling, and it's important to unbundle, that the competitive gains from doing so will offset the coordination losses. Whereas PPP scope assumes there's too little bundling, right? That putting the activities together will give a better result. It's not intellectually inconsistent to have these two approaches, because in one case you're talking about public procurement, right? And in another case, you're talking about the vertical structure of industry. But I think this stuff is really interesting. And there's no accounting for taste. But I'd be happy to take your questions.